Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Ginny Hallam of Halborns, and you're listening to our 10 Minutes with series. Halborns are parts of the awesome Empowering People group who support with tech-enabled people solutions, and a part of our support is this 10 Minutes with series. The news in respect of the economic outlook is not improving, is it? And undoubtedly business leaders will be looking to protect organisations. And I think what that's going to mean for people teams is that we're going to need to support with challenging people decisions and possible redundancies. So the Empowering People group have decided to do some solution sharing to help. We've produced 5 bite-sized sessions covering individual and collective consultation for redundancy, practical considerations for redundancy process, settlement agreements and outplacement. And in this session, the outstanding Rena Christou, MD and lawyer here at Halborns, is going to share her practical insights in respect of individual redundancy consultation. Welcome, Rena.
Hi, Dee. Thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and to chat through some of the key trends and themes that we see, and hopefully some practical tips as we go through as well.
Amazing. So I've got 4 questions for you. You've got 10 minutes. I know you normally have a lot to say, so should we get into it?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief.
Perfect. So question 1. I guess not everyone's going to know exactly what's the kind of legal definition of redundancy is and why it's important to understand that. Can you give us some help?
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually, because one of the common queries that we get asked is around redundancy and cost saving. And actually, from an employment law perspective, that's not a reason that we can rely on. So if we strip it back to what the legal test is to work out whether you've got a redundancy situation in the first place, there's 3 key reasons to fall back on. So the first one is there a business closure, which seems straightforward and generally speaking means therefore that you're in a situation where the business is closing and there are no jobs. So that kind of does what it says on the tin.
A bit like we've seen with made.com recently, I guess that would be a business closure.
Absolutely, yeah. Another example might be not quite so drastic, but where a site is closing. So, we're seeing in the press that big retail brands are closing up stores, for example, so where they're not trading particularly well. Again, if you're closing a particular site, that generally triggers a redundancy situation. Unless you're relocating to another site, but that's one for another day, given that you've given me 10 minutes. And then the main one that we see where we get the most queries is actually we've got a reduced requirement of the business for the particular type of work that an employee does. So where there's that reduced workload for the type of work that's being done, that's the one that's a little bit trickier because that doesn't always go hand in hand with the reasons that you might start looking at potential redundancies in the first place. And as I say, usually those conversations start as a result of looking at, restructuring to save costs and resources, but that isn't a reason that you can rely on from an employment law perspective. So it has to be one of those 3 that we said. And the main one that's a little bit trickier to quantify is there a reduced requirement of the particular type of work that employee, that role does.
No, that's really clear. So basically, in terms of the third option, we're saying, you've got a particular employee, they do a particular kind of work. Is there a reduction in that kind of work that they need to do, and that might then trigger a redundancy process?
Yeah, so exactly that. So you've got 5 salespeople, you need to go down to 4 because you don't quite need the 5 salespeople. The only thing that I would flag is that you can sometimes get a situation, and definitely worth picking up the phone about this one because it's a little bit more complicated, but where you think that you don't have a requirement for the role that you have, but actually you need a different role that's larger than the original role. So again, that can trigger a redundancy situation because what you're basically saying is we've got a reduced requirement for this smaller role, and actually what we need is a greater role that encompasses these additional things that we hadn't previously planned for. So effectively it's a new role, and again that can trigger a redundancy situation.
So where you're looking to reshape roles, again that could trigger a redundancy, so take early advice. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. And in terms of once you've identified that redundancy process and the need for a redundancy process, can you explain briefly the outline of what that individual redundancy process might look like?
Yeah, so once you've explained to affected employees that they're at risk of redundancy, the important next step is to consult with them, usually on an individual basis. So I know they're covering where redundancies are 20 or more individuals as part of a different session, but where you're looking at making less than 20 individuals redundant, effectively you need to consult with them about what that means for them. So for example, whether or not there are any workable alternatives that they can consider, And fundamentally, if there aren't any workable alternatives, then what does that mean for them? Are there any suitable vacancies that we can move them into? And if not, what redundancy might look like for them? So what that usually involves is 2 or 3 meetings with that individual, which makes it sound like a fairly short process. But effectively, it can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month to run through that process to fully explore the alternatives that both you and the employee can come up with together. And the reason for that is that when you go into a redundancy consultation process, you're going into it with an open mind about, right, we think these roles are at risk of redundancy. These are the business reasons as to why. Let's have a meeting to talk about that, to see whether you can come up with a different solution to the ones that we've managed to come up with. And if not, okay, well, fine. We've concluded that basically this role needs to go. And the next step is, how do we save you? So we've lost the role, but how do we save your employment? And that's when we move on to, which is usually the second or third meeting, to say, right, well, let's talk about those suitable alternatives, or let's talk about how we can support you as part of that redundancy dismissal.
No, that's really clear. And obviously there's loads to plan for. What would be your top 3 considerations when starting to think about making redundancies?
I think the key one for me is thinking about the wider communications to the business. So it's not just the employees that are impacted by the redundancy consultation process, but also those that might be seeing, colleagues that are impacted and worrying about their own job security. So there is a ripple effect to any redundancy consultation. It's about how you land those communications to make sure that the employees that are impacted feel that they're genuinely being taken through a process that is being explored with an open mind to finding ways to save their employment. So you've not predetermined the outcome that you're getting to, and that it's a done deal. And secondly, that's not only important for them, but also the wider population that we've talked about, but also how you make sure that they feel secure in the roles that they have, and they're not going to be facing a similar conversation, shortly down the line. We keep hearing all the time about there being, mass resignations. We keep hearing about the Great Resignation. We keep hearing about all these vacancies. So it's really important that if you do need to restructure or reshape your organisation, that you're landing the message about why that's happening, because it's not always doom and gloom that the business isn't doing well. There might be a valid business reason for looking at, actually, we're expanding in a different area, we've got a different focus, or we've just worked out that we can do things efficiently. So this isn't always, a negative conversation, but ultimately how you land that conversation could be perceived quite differently by that wider population, and also anybody that you're bringing into the business through a recruitment process.
No, that's really interesting. We see time and time again, don't we, the importance of communication and how you communicate and the words that you use, who you communicate with. So all that kind of mapping that out at an early stage, so that those consistent messages are heard by the right people is obviously crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as part of that, you might want to think about, so one of the other points that I was going to raise is voluntary redundancy. Again, there's connotations around that, meaning that you have to throw stacks of cash towards voluntary redundancy, and that's not the case. And also, I think there's sometimes a bit of a reluctance that might be perceived as, well, we've predetermined the outcome that this group of people are going, or this individual is going. And again, that's not how it's perceived by an employment tribunal. So voluntary redundancy, and I know it sounds a little bit odd, is actually perceived as a way of avoiding compulsory redundancies. So the reason that you might explore that and think about including voluntary redundancy is it allows the employee to keep control of the process. It means that you're managing the communications in a more positive way, because it feels like, rather than you forcing somebody down the process, it's a decision that they've made. And fundamentally, you can cut some of the consultation process that we mentioned down entirely, because you're giving employees the option to avoid going through the formal route to take voluntary redundancy instead. And as I say, it doesn't have to be an expensive route. So it could just be agreeing to offer, an employee not to work out their notice period, not to have to use up their holiday during their notice period. Obviously, the more attractive you make it, the more likely somebody is going to accept voluntary redundancy. But yeah, thinking about other tools that you can offer to soften the message of redundancy, and to show that you genuinely care as an organisation and that you're reflecting your values. So, for example, thinking about, well, how can we support you to land your next role? Looking at outplacement support, thinking about agreed references, giving some support in respect of an EAP. So again, thinking about people's mental well-being as part of this process. So really important tools to look at as part of the bigger picture around the employment law process side of it.
And I think you've gone on actually to answer my question 4. So in terms of the tips that you have on supporting employees. So you've talked about outplacement, you've talked about voluntary redundancy, EAP helplines, fantastic idea. Have you got anything else that you want to share? We're running out of time, so maybe one more suggestion.
Yeah, so the only thing that I would say is give yourself time and think about wider communications. So, for example, in terms of the time point, all I would say is make sure that you don't make employees feel that you're rushing to get to the next meeting and that you're rushing to get to the outcome of redundancy, because that can then be perceived as you not genuinely going into this process with a view to exploring alternatives. And in terms of the wider communication piece that we've talked about, the other thing that I would kind of group into that is wider image. So I'm not saying cancel Christmas, but for example, if you're telling employees that you are, having to make cutbacks in certain areas because of, the rising costs, to then throw a really plush Christmas party kind of contradicts that, or looking at paying out bonuses to certain individuals when you're making these redundancy cuts. These are all things that I would think about just to help, make the message slightly easier to swallow for those that are being taken through that process.
That's brilliant advice, and thank you so much for your thoughts today. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. All I would say is if anyone's got any questions that's going through, if we're even thinking about this process at an early stage, then please pick up the phones and ask us to chat it through, whether you're a client or not, to help kind of think about some of those things that helps you to plan for an effective process and that messaging that we talked about.
Fantastic. And if you want Rena's details, then if you email me at info@halborns.com, and I can link you up with Rena. It's also worth saying, Rena, isn't it, that we've devised an individual consultation toolkit for redundancies, which will support clients and anybody that wants it to manage effectively the process of the redundancy from end to end. It includes process map, agendas, the meetings, follow-up letters, so it really kind of holds your hand throughout and should make you super efficient in producing some fairly content-heavy meetings and follow-ups. Again, if you want more information on that, then it's info@halborns.com. Just leaves me to thank you again for all of your insight today, and thanks everyone for joining us.